Support for WUWM podcast comes from Life Navigators, your disability partner, offering disability services for over 75 years. More on their family resources at lifenavigators.org or their helpline, 414-774-6255.
From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Today we'll explore the history of the Bay View Massacre, which happened 140 years ago today. Then we'll check back in with a local farmer about how he's weathering economic changes.
It's pretty sad in the spring you get excited about planting, but they're actually hoping to have a break-even year. So it's tough right now, but that's how it is in farming. It goes through ups and downs.
Plus, we'll revisit a conversation with local Hollywood historian David Fantle, who unexpectedly passed away last month. His last book was on the making of the 1950 film Summer Stock, Judy Garland's last movie musical.
They put this script together, which Judy did not love, Gene Kelly certainly did not love, but they looked at it as something to get Judy back on her feet and back in front of the cameras.
All that's coming up on Lake Effect. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Thanks for joining us today. Today marks the 140th anniversary of the Bay View Massacre, the deadliest labor dispute in Wisconsin history. At least 9 people were shot and dozens more injured when a state militia fired on protesters making their way toward the Bay View rolling mill. They were calling for better working conditions, including an 8-hour workday. For the past 4 decades, people have gathered in Bay View at the former site of the rolling mill for a reenactment of what happened that day, and to remember those who died. Lake Effect's Joy Powers went to the memorial this past weekend and recorded these scenes from the reenactment.
I was here on May 5th, 1886.
Wow.
I had to be. Working 10 to 12-hour days was killing people and had been for decades. And now there was a national effort to change that. Workers needed a voice in such basic issues as how many hours a day we would work. The movement had grown strong. We were winning. 12,000 of us picked May 1st to walk out for the 8-hour day. On May 2nd, a Sunday afternoon like today, all of us strikers marched down Grand Avenue to a huge rally of 9,000 more workers at Milwaukee Gardens at 14th and State. The 8-hour day movement. That's what we called it. That's what it was.
Today's parade saw almost every working man and woman in Milwaukee participating. So I ask you, why all this fuss? Why should we walk away from jobs that provide bread for our families? The better question is, why should labor fill the world with wealth while we live in want? To work like a slave, see your wife and children in rags, to rise at 4 a.m., work for 12 hours, throw our tired bones on the bed at night, to live without leisure, without rest. This isn't a living. This is dying a slow, torturous death until exhaustion takes its toll with the loss of a job, a limb, or a life. The hours of work must be shortened. 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours to do what we will. The 8-hour day. The 8-hour day. The 8-hour day.
Here in Milwaukee. Milwaukee, you harbor agitators who have been driven from the fatherland for violation of laws. Now they believe they will be permitted to violate the laws here, to incite mobs and riots. Such men should not be permitted to promulgate their doctrines in this glorious state of Wisconsin among her industrious, law-abiding citizens. The intelligent people of Wisconsin will never permit the red flag of anarchy to float within her borders. And so I say to the commanders of our militia, whenever the time comes for you to tackle a mob in this state, I'll be there, and you'll get your orders from me.
On Wednesday, May 5th, 1,500 of us started out early for the Bay View Mill. We promised to close the mill for good if the owners wouldn't respect our demands. We knew the politicians and the mayor were against our 8-hour movement, but we didn't imagine the lengths to which our governor, Jeremiah Rusk, would go to stop us. None of us was armed. We walked 4 abreast down Mitchell Street.
The 8-hour day. The 8-hour day.
From St. Stanislaus Church, we walked toward the mill, but the militia was waiting for us. When the governor was notified that we were heading to the mill in full force, he sent these orders to the militia captain. Fire on them. And so the captain told his forces, pick out your man and kill him. Shoot him where he stands.
Oh.
7 of us were shot in the street by fellow citizens for marching in the line.
At this point, we're going to observe a final moment of silence as Wisconsin Labor History Society President Emeritus Ken Germanson and Painters Local 781 member Lee Moniel lay a wreath in memory of those killed in the Bay View Massacre.
The years roll around and they yellow the page, but the history of labor don't mellow with age. One of the workers will always run red when the winds blow time for a change.
That was part of last weekend's reenactment and commemoration of the Bay View Massacre. Today is the 140th anniversary of the event, which led to major changes in politics and in labor rights in Wisconsin and the U.S. Although the massacre has become a well-known part of Milwaukee's history, there are still some mysteries that remain. Last year, a listener wrote into WUWM's Bubbler Talk to ask about one of them. Here's that story.
Bubbler Talk, quenching Milwaukee's thirst for knowledge.
On May 5th, 1886, thousands of protesters in Milwaukee were nearing the Bay View rolling mill when the first shots rang out. The protesters were part of the 8-hour movement, seeking better working conditions for laborers in Milwaukee and beyond. State militia had been tasked with guarding the mill. Historian John Gerda explains.
A crowd of roughly 1,200 strikers, largely Polish, gathered at St. Stanislaus Church on 5th and Mitchell, marched down Mitchell Street first and then Kinnickinnick to march on the rolling mill. They found the militia waiting for them, and at a distance of roughly 200 yards, the militia opened fire.
As the smoke faded, the devastation became clear. At least 9 people had been shot. The event became known as the Bay View Massacre. But who were the victims, and where were they buried? That's what listener Brenna Ackert wanted to know. She began her own research into the victims, but wrote to Bubbler Talk after reaching some dead ends.
So I was curious if anyone could find any information, because I certainly couldn't. Sometimes we can find names, but that's usually about it. That's like as far as we could go, at least in my own digging.
But let's take a step back and look at what led to the massacre. The 8-hour movement was born out of the poor working conditions for factory workers in the mid-1800s. Laborers were expected to work 6 days a week for 10 to 12 hours at a time in grueling conditions.
Their goal was an 8-hour day without a cut in pay. So if you're working 12 hours a day for $1.25 a day on the labor side, that's a big deal. So it was a major request. And Milwaukee and Chicago became the epicenters of that movement in the entire country. And the first week of May 1886 was really among the most volatile in Milwaukee's history.
Starting on May 1st, laborers in Milwaukee and Chicago went on strike. Both cities were filled with strikers, united by a common cause. But on May 4th, these protests turned deadly in Chicago when an unknown man threw dynamite into the crowd, killing at least a dozen people. At the same time, tensions were rising in Milwaukee. Wisconsin's Republican Governor Jeremiah Rusk had ordered the National Guard into Milwaukee to quell the protests. As protesters neared the mill, the orders were given.
The captain of the militia said, "Pick out your man and kill him." So this was not shooting over their heads to frighten the crowd and have them go back to the south side. This was certainly intentional.
According to news reports from the day, the street looked like a battlefield. People lay dying, bleeding. Since 1986, the centennial anniversary of the massacre, the Wisconsin Labor History Society has held a ceremony honoring the dead with 7 beats to represent the 7 victims believed to have died that day. As question asker Brenna Ackert mentions, there are a number of named victims, but the names change depending on the source you're looking at. What remains consistent is the number 7. After a quick, targeted search on Ancestry.com, using the most consistent names listed, I was able to find death certificates for 4 of the named victims: Frank Kunkel, Frank Navarchek, Martin Yankoviak, and Michael Rakolski. These death certificates are very helpful because they include other identifying information, including where they were buried. But that was where my good luck ran out. As I started to search for other names, it became clear this would be a difficult task. John Gerda notes that's kind of how this research goes.
Tedious, granular, and I think the lesson from a lot of this research is that history is messy.
To dig into this mess, I used 3 main resources in the Milwaukee Public Library's Zeidler Room: city directories, historic newspapers, and local history books. I started by trying to find these men in the city directories with mixed results. That's when I headed to the historic newspaper database to find contemporary accounts of what happened that day. But these newspapers, while helpful, are only as reliable as the author, as librarian Heather Smith explains.
You have to understand how information is collected and recorded.
She uses the census as an example.
So if a census worker who's a complete stranger to you comes to your door, they're going to write down what you tell them in their record. So if they get some detail wrong because they perceived that you spoke with an accent and they didn't clearly understand what you said to them, that's what gets put into the census records that we now are using for research decades later.
A few things became clear in reading the accounts from that day. The scene was chaotic, and American journalists weren't great at deciphering Polish names. Some victims I had confirmed through death certificates had entirely wrong names listed in the papers. In one article on the day of the massacre from the Milwaukee Daily Journal, Frank Navarchek was listed as Jacques Narakak. Martin Yankoviak was instead called Marcus Yokoveski. It also included John Marsh among the victims. Now, John Marsh was one of the 3 remaining names that I was searching for, along with Johann Zaska and Robert Erdman. But as the dust settled the following day, there was an updated list in the Daily Journal with the proper names of everyone who had been shot. John Marsh was now John Moschk. John Moschk had a death certificate that confirmed he'd been killed during the massacre. The misspelling of his name wasn't an anomaly, as librarian Heather Smith notes.
All of this stuff was, in many cases, communicated verbally. If things were written down, they were written down in a non-standardized fashion, which is why you'll find variations in spelling in historical records.
In fact, different newspapers would often write names differently. Although he was known as John Moschke in the Daily Journal, he was called Johann Moschke in the Sentinel. Over time, it's likely that John Moschke had been split into two separate victims due to the variance in how his name was spelled. Reading through the newspapers of that time shines light on another reality. Many didn't view these protesters as victims, and that's borne out in their death certificates.
The certificate of Michael Ruhalski, the cause of death is listed as shot in a mob. That's editorial. That's saying this is a guy who was kind of out with the rabble. And it was a fairly accurate reflection, I think, of how people in the mainstream kind of thought of the disturbances in that first week of May.
That gets to another reality. Most newspapers seemed more concerned about the threat to public order than they were about the fate of those who had been shot. Updates on the injured sunk lower and lower in the newspapers. Most had stopped covering them entirely, less than a week after the massacre. Instead, the newspapers focused on the criminal trials of those who had led the movement.
Any threat to law and order is met with resistance by the establishment. That's why it's called the establishment. Both the corporate side and the media side as well. So you have a city shut down by strikers who were marching from one employer to another to dramatize their demands. That was clearly a challenge to the status quo.
The majority of protesters were recent immigrants, and not all of them had ties to the community. These were people who could go missing without much notice, making it very difficult to track them down. The massacre had also pitted neighbor against neighbor. The local Kosciuszko Guards were among the militiamen who fired on the protesters. They were also Polish immigrants who lived in the same community. While the newspapers lauded the bravery of the militia, many in the Polish community came out against them.
They were boycotted by the people on the South Side, and at the same time, people of Polish background in general were kind of stigmatized as Polanders and drunkards need not apply to jobs. So they were kind of the troublesome workers. But also internally, there was division about, the people who being shot at and the people who were shooting.
It's unclear what happened to the 4 other victims with serious injuries. But after a lot of research, I can definitively say at least 5 people died. And I know where they're buried. Holy Trinity Cemetery, now part of St. Adelbert Cemetery in Milwaukee's Morgandale neighborhood. With this information in hand, I went to the cemetery with our question asker, Brenna, and told her what I'd found.
You have really tracked down so much information. I'm so glad I reached out to Bubbler Talk to say, hey, take it away from here. Thank you for looking into this. This has been incredible.
We checked in at the cemetery office and asked them to look up records from the 1880s. There wasn't a single record left from 1886. The exact location of the Bay View Massacre victims' graves seemed to have been lost to time. But the people they represented are still there, and their stories still resonate with our world today.
The larger picture is absolutely incontrovertibly correct, where you have an oppressed workforce resisting oppression and the forces of capital clamping down, closing in. That's the story, and we need to keep sight of that and the impact it had on politics later on families certainly. So whether it's 5, whether it's 7, whether it's 9, people died. And they died violent deaths at the hands of their neighbors.
At least 9 people were shot that day in May. Many were severely injured, like Kazimir Dudek, who was shot 4 times in the arm and lost half his jaw. Most victims were laborers whose livelihoods depended on their good health, and those who survived were never the same after that day. But neither was Milwaukee. Although these protests were incredibly controversial, the massacre had helped shift public opinion on labor rights. The sacrifices of the protesters led to better working conditions in the mills and factories, and the rise of a new political party.
It broke the back of the 8-hour movement, but also galvanized those workers to organize politically. So they established a People's Party that swept the next elections, the fall elections. And that was a very important catalyst for the rise of the socialists in Milwaukee.
And maybe learning all of that is worth a bit of digging. For Bubbler Talk, I'm Joy Powers.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
To learn more about the reporting Joy did on the Bay View Massacre, subscribe to the Bubbler Talk podcast and listen later this week for a special 10-year anniversary season. It will feature an extended conversation with Joy about reporting the very first Bubbler Talk story and others like the one you just heard. Need some flexibility for when you listen? You can hear Lake Effect on demand. Find it as a podcast wherever you like to listen to download and enjoy on the go. Later in the show, we'll revisit a conversation with local author David Fantle, who died last month. But first, we'll have the next segment in our economic check-in series. We'll visit Cozy Nook Farm coming up on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM Milwaukee's NPR.
Oh, tell me how you can. Will you be a lousy scab or will you be a man?
You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Tom Oberhaus is the co-operator of Cozy Nook Farm in Waukesha County. Cozy Nook is primarily a dairy farm, and it supplements its business with seasonal pumpkin and Christmas tree sales. When Lake Effect's Sam Woods spoke with Oberhaus in January, Christmas tree sales were down, and the farm was planning for 2026. The conversation is part of WUWM's commitment to covering issues our listeners say are top priorities, including the economy. As part of that coverage, we're exploring how the economy is impacting Wisconsinites with different financial needs and concerns. Sam checked back in with Oberhaus to see how things are going on the farm ahead of planting season.
Last time we talked, it was right after Christmas season. It was a little bit slower than usual, following a good pumpkin season, but a little bit slower. And I asked you what's next. This is in January, and you said, right now I'm looking to make plans for the growing season and the year ahead. So anything you're ready to announce is what's next for Cozy Nook Farm in the next few months?
I'm not sure we have any great grand plans. We're kind of especially my wife and I are in that mature age group that we just kind of like to ride things out the way we're doing them. But you always like to make some capital improvements. So we got one of them done yesterday. We got a new floor put in our milk house. That's pretty exciting. And this afternoon I got a guy coming here to sign on putting new tin on this building that we're in. So it'll look a whole lot better. Fertilizer, everybody's talking about fertilizer prices and that. Us, like the majority of farmers, have all their fertilizer booked in the fall. Luckily, we're in a position, and most of us are, that 90% of it or so was actually paid for in December. So rising fertilizer prices doesn't cause us any challenge personally. So fertilizer's all been bought, seeds all been bought. We're just waiting for Mother Nature to warm the soils up and we can start planting. We're getting some sunshine, so we're all getting itching to go out there. And the exciting thing is we did get our alfalfa and grass planted on March 30th. We had a beautiful day there. It was 75 degrees and sunshiny. The next day, of course, was cold. But anyways, we got our alfalfa and grass in, and I've looked, and it is up. It's only, maybe about 1/8 of an inch up, but it is out of the ground. And so that certainly makes you smile and get happy about things.
So you hit on a number of things that I want to talk about: new floor in the milk house, capital improvements, fertilizer, recent rain. But I want to start by going back a little bit to fertilizer, because that's something I am not a farmer, but I certainly read headlines about the agricultural economy, and that's been a big one, especially since start of the war with Iran. That fertilizer prices may be going up, and of course I thought of you. But it sounds like you buy a lot of your fertilizer by late fall. For the season up ahead, so that price shocks right now haven't hit you as directly. Am I hearing that right?
Absolutely, and that's true of the vast majority of farmers, not all farmers, but it was all booked and paid for in the fall, so we're good there. The thing we aren't booked for is fuel, and we use quite a bit of fuel. And we did not have our fuel booked, so we'll be paying the extra rate on that. But we don't use near as much fuel as we did in days of old. In days of old, when we tilled the soil to plant it and things, we used a lot more fuel. Like a lot of farmers in this area in particular, we're conservation farmers. We We use very, very little tillage, so it's pretty much just the planter going through the field burning up fuel.
Can you give an idea of the percentage rise in expenses that higher fuel costs might run you this year? Have you kind of planned that out?
We're firm believers, or maybe hopefuls, that the whole Iranian thing will pass here in the not way too distant future, and the oil prices will come back down and whatnot. So no, we haven't done any real good calculations as to how much this does affect our cost of production. Good things we ought to do, but we haven't done those yet.
So this is a dairy farm, right?
Yeah.
So cows are kind of the main thing this time of year.
Absolutely.
But you mentioned alfalfa earlier. What else is going in the ground this year? And is there anything different from previous years?
Pretty much the same as the last few years. Our alfalfa and grass was planted. That's a perennial crop. Those fields will stay in alfalfa or grass for several years, probably 4 years at least. And then here in another week or so, we'll get at planting corn and soybeans. The corn is mostly to feed the cows. The soybeans, we actually sell them and buy soybean meal back to feed the cows. So we feed them the soybeans, but not directly. It actually works out better to sell and buy. And then we grow a fair amount of triticale. Triticale is planted right after we harvest corn silage, which was last September. So it was planted last September. It's growing very nicely out there right now. We'll harvest it for the cows to eat here about mid-May, and then we will no-till soybeans into that and still get a good crop of soybeans for harvest this fall.
This is WWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I am Lake Effect Sam Wood speaking with Tom Oberhaus from Cozy Nook Farm for our Economic Check-In series. And Tom, you were just talking about plants that were going in the ground this year, some to feed cows, some to sell, and you mentioned soybeans. And again, not a farmer myself, but read some headlines, and soybeans doesn't seem like it's the best seller's market it's ever been for soybeans. But take me inside. You work with this crop. You made the choice to plant it. Take me into kind of your thought process and how what you're gonna do with the soybeans specifically.
So it's a very marginally profitable crop right now, but it's a great rotational crop. Soybeans leave nitrogen in the soil for the corn crop to follow the next year. It's just good agronomics for us to grow the soybeans, and it's always good to be diversified.
Earlier this year, Trump announced an intention to send $12 billion of aid to farmers across the country, and it was pitched as to kind of balance losses from tariffs. Now, I know you don't ship too much internationally, but have you been following this at all, and are you on the receiving end of that aid package at all?
I think virtually everybody that grew corn and or beans, and cotton and rice and all kinds of things, there was what they called a bridge payment, supposed to bridge us over until next year, hopefully being better. But we run a very diversified operation, so it all fits together, and hopefully we make a profit at the end of the year. But and right now, grain crops are not very good financially. It's, in fact, most of the grain crop farmers are trying to budget for a break-even year. It's pretty sad. In the spring, you get excited about planting, but they're actually hoping to have a break-even year. So it's tough right now, but that's how it is in farming. It goes through ups and downs, and we're in a down period right now. We're in a big up period 4 years ago. When things are good, you need to save money because you know that things not so good are coming.
Would you say that the federal aid that you're receiving goes to, these new capital improvements that you're looking for? You mentioned new floor in the milk house, or is it more of just to balance the book for what you're expecting to be kind of a break-even year?
We kind of budget ourselves as a farm to be break-even. Everybody working here, we're an LLC, collects a salary, and then we try to just run the farm at break-even. If we have extra money, we usually spend it on capital improvements. And so, yes, the government money supplied a little extra money, and we felt we had money in the budget to make these capital improvements for this year. And hopefully, you got to make capital improvements every year, otherwise everything just runs down into the dump and you have nothing left.
Got to keep growing and spending money to make money, right?
Right.
So another big piece of federal policy, Farm Bill. The last full Farm Bill was signed in 2018, but it's been extended year by year since it officially expired in 2023. We're now talking about a 2026 Farm Bill. And I know the Farm Bill is a huge overarching policy document for agricultural economy meant to, set a kind of 5-year vision. And so understanding that this is a big document kind of covering everything food and farming in the United States, is it something that you're keeping your eye on?
Certainly keep our eyes on it because, like you say, it gives like a 5-year direction and gives you a little insight as to how you ought to manage your farm, and looking forward to capital improvements and whatnot. And so, we need a farm bill passed so we know what's going on. The tough challenge with the farm bill is most of the farm bill is not really anything to do with the farm. It's food assistance programs. Most of the dollars in the farm program is food assistance. So, it's frustrating, like a whole lot of things that Congress can't sit down and figure things out, and nobody's going to get their way. That's the way government works. You give and go, and you agree to go with somewhere in between. But it's frustrating they can't do that.
Again, Farm Bill meant to be a kind of 5-year document that more or less stays what it is for that 5 years. Yes. But the last few years has just been kind of renewing year by year. Yeah. How does that change either your economic calculus or your plans for the future when the Farm Bill is just re-upped year by year as opposed to that kind of 5-year plan?
We're a small family, diversified operation, and we think we have enough flexibility just kind of take what we have for the year and manage that. So it's not such a big deal for us. But for a lot of people and younger people trying to figure out where they're going and whatnot, it's crucial. So it's crucial for the industry. It's not so crucial for us personally.
Is there anything in particular you're hoping is in the next Farm Bill?
Oh boy, big questions there. Since I'm a dairy farmer, I would certainly hope that we continue to have some of the programs available that we can actually buy insurance to kind of put a floor on the milk price. I think that's crucial to a whole lot of dairymen.
How would that change things for you?
So we've had it it's been available the last handful of years, but every year you don't know if it's going to be there next year or not. As I say, we're a mature operation. We're diversified and we're very flexible, and we just manage our way through on a yearly basis.
I appreciate you rolling with me on those kind of vague questions about a huge document. So thank you.
Yeah. We're a unique operation that things like that will make it. We just gotta adjust a little bit on a yearly basis, and sure, it would be nice to have a 5-year plan so then you know that you had that for 5 years or whatnot. But we're okay. We're of the old school that we think less government is better, and if we had less government involved in farming, we would all be better off because we would all be forced to handle our own struggles, financial struggles, and make for a stronger agriculture in the long run.
So, Tom, I know you to be an optimistic person. It's something that has come through in every check-in that we've done before. It was coming through here where you're saying, we'll make it through. Somehow we'll make it through. You seem like someone who has a lot of faith in yourself, faith in the operation, and someone who knows they're going to make it through no matter what. But looking forward, is there anything that you have some economic anxiety about, or just something that is, on your mind as a potential problem down the road?
Yeah, not so much personally for myself because of age, but we need to have better programs to get young people involved in farming. That's the That's the biggest, scariest thing in agriculture right now is that the average age of a farmer is, 60 or something like that. Because the economics are so poor that most any farm boy can get a job off the farm and do much better financially than on the farm. So, and I don't know what kind of government policies that can be developed or whatnot, but I think that's the challenge for the government people to figure out how do we put together programs that help young farmers get involved in agriculture and stay in agriculture.
So your worries are more about the industry 5, 10, 30 years down the line, not Cozy Nook in 2026.
Absolutely, yes. As we said, we'll weather this year. I mean, if we have a terrible weather or whatever, it's going to hurt, but it's not going to cause bankruptcy. You just pick up your shoes and keep on plodding through.
There's that optimism. I knew it was there. Well, Tom, thank you so much for joining me on Lake Effect. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for coming out.
Tom Oberhaus is the co-operator of Cozy Nook Farm in Waukesha County. He spoke with Lake Effect Sam Woods as a part of our check-in series about the changing economic landscape. This reporting is part of WUWM's focus coverage on 3 issues our community told us they care about: climate change, immigration, and the economy. You can find more coverage on these issues at WUWM.com. Up next, we'll learn about the making of the musical Summer Stock and why one local author thought it was worth bringing back into the spotlight. Keep listening to Lake Effect on Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on WUWM. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. Local author David Fantle spent nearly his whole life interviewing Golden Age celebrities to preserve their stories for posterity. He died unexpectedly at his home in Milwaukee following a cardiovascular emergency last month at the age of 66. In addition to being a Hollywood historian, Fantle had a 40-year career in marketing and communications, including at Visit Milwaukee, where he was instrumental in bringing the Bronze Fonz to the city. He also sat on the board of the Holocaust Education Resource Center and taught film and PR classes at Marquette University for 18 years. In Fantle's honor, we're revisiting my conversation with him about the 1950 MGM musical film Summer Stock, starring Judy Garland and Gene Kelly.
Forget your troubles, come on, get happy. You better chase all your cares away. Shout hallelujah, come on, get happy. Get ready for the judgment day.
That song from the film Get Happy is well known in the Garland songbook, but the film itself isn't. David Fantle thought it was worth bringing back into the spotlight, so he and Tom Johnson co-wrote the book Come On, Get Happy, The Making of Summer Stock. Here's our conversation from 2023. Your book has been 40 years in the making. So to start, why Summer Stock, and what about it has kept you so invested all these years?
Well, the love of the Hollywood musical goes back even more than 40 years for me and my co-writer Tom Johnson. So when we were teenagers, and like many people saw That's Entertainment in 1974, we were 15 years old. We got hooked on musicals from that point on and really have never looked back. When you say 40 years in the making, I mean, rolling up the sleeves and the hard work for this book was a good 4 years, the past 4 years, but you're right. We were fortunate as college journalists back at the University of Minnesota to have what you might call tenacity, pluck, chutzpah, nerve, whatever, to actually go to Los Angeles as college journalists. And we're fortunate in 1978, at the age of 18, to have green-lit meetings with Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly.
Amazing.
Yeah. And, when you meet Fred Astaire and Gene Kelly, and they're so universally revered, it opened the door to dozens, or actually hundreds of more Golden Age stars that we were fortunate enough to meet. And during those meetings, it included 2 visits with Gene Kelly, a visit with Harry Warren, the 3-time Academy Award composer who is the principal songwriter of Summer Stock, Eddie Bracken, who has a really fun supporting role as the sort of neurotic fiancé of the Judy Garland character, as well as Charles Walters, sort of the unheralded great director of these MGM musicals who directed Summer Stock. Now, our interviews and our meetings 40 plus years ago weren't strictly pointed at talking about Summer Stock, because we didn't know at that time that 40 some years later we'd actually write a book. But we did ask questions about it. Unfortunately, we retained tapes and notes and other things, and we're able to include those primary research interviews into our book.
What do you think it is about Summer Stock that's made it been overlooked in the history of all the musical canons that we think about, especially in film? Like even the hardcore musical fans maybe aren't as familiar with it, or they kind of dismiss it.
I think the plot probably is what people dismiss the most, because the plot, arguably, or admittedly, I could say, is not really advancing the art of the film musical. It was looked at as a little bit of a throwback to the Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, hey, let's put a show on in the barn kind of things that they were doing about 10 years ago. But at this point in Judy's career, this was 1949 when they started production, Judy's career was a little bit rocky. I mean, and again, she had a marriage that was all but over with director Vincent Minnelli. She had a growing addiction to prescription medications. She had a 3-year-old toddler to care for, Liza Minnelli. So a lot of things were working against Judy at the time. And so they put this script together, which Judy did not love. Gene Kelly certainly did not love. But they looked at it as something to get Judy back on her feet and back in front of the cameras.
Yeah, so let's explain the plot briefly here. There's a barn dance.
Yeah, right.
Stuff happens in a barn.
So, Judy plays a strong, independent woman, and I think that is overlooked a bit when you think about Summer Stock. But essentially, she plays a Connecticut farm owner who loses her hired hands, and she's faced with bringing in her crops all by herself or with little to no help other than a tractor, which seems to have an ongoing role in this plot of the film. And all of a sudden, her ambitious younger sister, Abigail, played by Gloria DeHaven, decides to bring a troupe of aspiring actors to their barn to stage a barnyard musical that was really directed by the Gene Kelly character who plays Joe Ross. So it is a variation on let's put a show on in the barn musical. And the last several minutes of this film is devoted to what we call a show within a movie. Mm-hmm. And that is all of the different musical scenes.
Just number after number.
Number after number. And of course, it ends on an incredible high note with the iconic Judy Garland number, Get Happy.
Right. So people are probably more familiar with the closing song, Get Happy, than they are the movie that it came from. So let's talk about some of the factors that brought this movie to be. MGM was pretty much considered the studio for musical movies. So what factors were playing within this studio that led up and drove this film's production, despite the leads maybe not liking the script and other things that kind of complicated its production?
Well, Summer Stock was just on the slate of planned productions. I mean, MGM and all the major studios at that time were still factories. That's what they were doing. They were self-contained factories that were churning out 30 to 50 feature films each. And as early as December 1948, the Hollywood Trades announced that Summer Stock would be a future production at MGM Studios and produced by Joe Pasternak. So Summer Stock was just another production in the factory system at MGM. It went before the cameras in late 1949. Gene and Judy weren't really too thrilled about the script itself, but they all managed to overcome that and really churn out a really fun, enjoyable entertainment. And when we don't talk about it in the same breath as some of the other musicals we just mentioned, I will make the case, and I hope the book does, and if you watch the film, it makes the case, that for 109 minutes, there is some incredibly entertaining musical numbers if you look beyond the script. Now, I'm not going to mention the Phil Silvers, Gene Kelly Heavenly Music number as one of them. But Gene Kelly's personal favorite tap dance solo, which he does with a squeaky floorboard and an old newspaper, is his personal favorite tap dance that he did in any of his movies. We have Judy Garland's Get Happy, which is on the short list of anyone's favorite Judy Garland film numbers. You have the Portland Fancy, which is probably, of the three films that Kelly and Garland made together, is the best dance number that those two do together. It's a tap solo in the barn. It's sort of like an old-style challenge dance. Like we use the analogy of Annie, get your gun. Anything you can do, I can do better. Kelly does a move, Judy can meet that move and does it. There's an overlooked ballad, sort of the style, you could say, of Over the Rainbow, and that's called Friendly Star. And it's a very lovely number. It never really had legs beyond Summer Stock, probably because it was upstaged by Get Happy. And there's the Dig for Your Dinner, which is sort of like a weird Southern revivalist kind of thing. Again, Phil Silvers, a little over the top with his shtick. But Gene Kelly does an amazing tap number, and Kelly works so beautifully with tap dancing in really confined spaces. And I think the Dig for Your Dinner number is a perfect example of that.
So Gene Kelly and Judy Garland, they're, of course, the star power behind this. They've worked together over their careers. Can you share a bit about what Judy Garland and Gene Kelly's careers were at this point? You mentioned Judy's troubles with prescription, what do we want to call them? Medication.
Yeah,
They
right.
called them energy pills,
Yeah,
right?
right.
But they also had a great working relationship together, despite whatever the project was they had. Like when they were together, it was something special.
Well, Gene and Judy started, Gene's first film was 1942. It was For Me and My Gal, and it it starred Judy Garland. And Judy Garland, after Wizard of Oz in 1939, was sort of money in the bank at MGM throughout the 1940s. But Gene loved Judy and always felt that he was indebted to her because Gene came from the stage, Pal Joey in particular, and he was used to projecting to the third balcony. Judy helped him in 1942 for that film sort of tone it down and how to really act in front of the camera. They didn't work together again until 1948. They made an ambitious film that is sort of a cult classic today called The Pirate. And then they reteamed again. They started in 49 for the 1950 release of Summer Stock. Gene Kelly's career was on the ascension. He was an A-lister by this time. Immediately after Summer Stock wrapped, he went into another landmark musical, An American in Paris, which won a Best Picture Academy Award. So Gene was on the ascension, and Judy was having more and more issues. While Gene wasn't thrilled with the plot of Summer Stock, he knew and the studio knew that they needed to surround Judy Garland with people that were friends of hers and people that she trusted. So that being said, they brought in Chuck Walters, who had directed Judy in Easter Parade in 1948, Gene Kelly, Eddie Bracken, Gloria DeHaven, Phil Silvers. What did they do? They acted as this giant security blanket around Judy. They protected Judy and helped bring her over the finish line to complete the Summer Stock production.
So this book also addresses some key myths. You heard about the making of this film that you dove a little deeper into with your research. What were those ones that you wanted to dispel to kind of bring this movie up in public opinion?
I think most people think that the long production and the problems that this production was beset with was solely the fault of Judy Garland, her absences, her growing problems. And that is entirely not true. Did she come late? Yes. Did she miss some days of production? Certainly. But there were other factors. By December of 1949, they realized they had only 5 songs. They realized that the 5 songs were not going to carry them over the finish line. What does that mean? That means they had to write, compose, orchestrate, record, and film new numbers. That extended the length of the film production time. The other myth is that people think that the last thing filmed was Judy Garland's number, Get Happy. Some even think that it was a film number she had filmed for a previous film and it was cut and they inserted it and edited into Summer Stock. All myths. Get Happy was shot only a couple weeks after Judy wrapped her initial production. They brought her back. She personally selected Get Happy. Chuck Walters beautifully choreographed and filmed it, and it was done. But the other thing is, it was not the last number shot for the film. The last number that was actually shot for the film was Gene Kelly's squeaky board newspaper solo dance. So, if anything, we want to make it clear that Judy Garland was not the sole reason the film took 6 months to complete.
Yeah. With MGM right now, currently, it's no longer an independent studio. Long ago lost its status as a powerhouse studio as the film business has changed, since that heyday of musical production. But what do you want readers to learn and appreciate about Summer Stock over 70 years later?
Well, that it still has some of the best numbers, musical, and it's one of the last great tap dance musicals. Yeah, it was Singing in the Rain. There were still some tap dance numbers to come and musicals to come, but we think it's one of the last great tap dance musicals. And again, in 109 minutes, I think you're going to see more show-stopping numbers than many of the more well-known musicals of that era. And you're exactly right. The studio system by 1950 was changing dramatically, and we really write about that. Louis B. Mayer, the head of the benevolent, I say that in air quotes, head of the studio since 1924, since its inception, was almost on the way out. Dory Sherry, a younger, more progressive filmmaker, was on the way in. He was the head of production. TV was encroaching. We had the Hollywood blacklist that was taking place at the time. We had the studios, the monopoly that the studios had with their distribution of films and owning theaters being broken up by the federal government. So the whole grasp that the studio system had for the previous 20 years was starting to crumble. And we talk about the circumstances in which Summer Stock was made during 49 and 1950.
Well, David, thank you so much for coming to talk more about Summer Stock. And if anyone's interested and hasn't seen it, PSA, it is available to watch on YouTube for free. So
That's right.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Audrey.
There's a star for everyone, brightly shining in the
David Fantle co-authored the book Come On Get Happy, The Making of Summer Stock. We recorded this conversation in 2023. Fantle died unexpectedly at his Milwaukee home last month at the age of 66. That's Lake Effect for today. I'm Audrey Nowakowski. If you've missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at wuwm.com. If you'd like to take us on the go, just download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll learn about the International Maritime Music Directory based right here in Wisconsin. Thank you so much for joining us today, right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM Milwaukee's NPR.
Where can you